Dawn used to arrive softly in that town, like it was afraid of being noticed. Pale light slipped through cracked window panes and settled on the warped floorboards of the boarding house, revealing dust that never quite rested. Clara May Holloway was already awake when the sun came. She always was. Sleep never stayed long in a body that learned to listen for pain before it arrived. She knelt on the floor with a bucket beside her, hands submerged in cold, gray water. Each breath rattled, shallow and sharp, as if her lungs had forgotten how to expand all the way. When she coughed, she turned her face toward the wall, pressing her sleeve to her mouth. The cloth bloomed dark for a moment. Then she folded it inward, hiding the stain like a secret she was ashamed to own. In that house, sickness was treated like a crime. Silas Crow believed suffering was best cured by work, and if work did not cure it, then punishment might. He stood heavy in doorways, arms crossed, eyes narrowed not with anger but with calculation. Clara learned early that pain meant nothing to him unless it slowed her hands. When it did, when her knees buckled or her breath failed her, he called it laziness. He called her useless. He called her too sick to earn her keep, as if illness were a choice she'd made out of spite. The beatings were never loud. That was the worst part. No shouting to alert the neighbors. No dramatic cruelty that demanded attention. Just a shove too hard, a strike meant to teach, a boot nudging ribs until breath came back properly. Afterwards, Clara would lie still on the floor, staring at a knot in the wood, counting heartbeats until the world stopped spinning. She learned how to disappear without leaving the room. The town knew. Towns always do. Pain has a way of seeping through walls, carried on whispers and sideways glances. Mrs. Delilah Pruitt leaned across counters and spoke Clara's name like it was a cautionary tale. "That girl's no good," she'd murmur. "Always sick, always failing. Some folks just aren't built to pull their weight." Heads nodded. Judgment settled easy like dust on windowsills. Clara heard it all. She heard the laughter that followed her down the street, the sighs when she moved too slowly, the irritation when she paused to catch her breath. Shame became something she wore, heavier than any bruise. She began to believe the town was right, that her weakness was a burden, that if she could just endure quietly enough, the world might forgive her for existing. On mornings when the coughing was worst, when her vision blurred and the room tilted sideways, Silas's patience ran thin. "You rest, you don't eat," he'd say flatly. Hunger gnawed at her in steady waves, but she told herself it was deserved. A body that couldn't work didn't deserve comfort. That was the rule she lived by, even when no one was watching. Across the street, in the shadow of the general store, Ethan Cole often paused with his reins loose in one hand, pretending to study the weathered boards of a building he'd seen 1,000 times before. He was a quiet man, known for keeping to the edges of things. Folks said he'd lost his wife to a fever years back and never quite returned to himself. His ranch sat alone beyond the cottonwoods, empty but for the sound of wind and the creak of a porch that missed footsteps. Ethan noticed Clara the way lonely men notice small changes in familiar landscapes. At first, it was just her slowness, then the way she flinched when voices rose, then the bruises she didn't bother hiding anymore, as if covering them required energy she no longer had. He told himself it wasn't his business. Pain was common currency in places like this. Intervening rarely made things better. Still, he watched. He saw her stagger once, knees folding under her like paper gone soft in rain. He saw Silas drag her upright by the arm, muttering words that carried no mercy. Ethan's jaw tightened, his hands clenched around the leather reins. Memory stirred. A bed too empty, a sickness he hadn't been able to fight, the helplessness of loving someone fading away. He turned his horse away before guilt could harden into resolve. The breaking came on an afternoon heavy with heat. The air inside the boarding house clung to Clara's skin, thick and unforgiving. She scrubbed the floor slowly, each stroke sending pain up her arms and into her chest. Her breath caught, shallow and sharp, until suddenly there was no strength left to rise. The bucket tipped. Water spilled. Clara collapsed beside it, cheek pressed to the boards, vision narrowing to a thin line of light. Silas's shadow fell over her. "Playing dead now," he said, voice low and irritated. The kick came quick, meant to remind her where she stood. Pain flared white-hot, and then there was nothing but ringing silence. When Clara opened her eyes again, she saw boots she didn't recognize. Worn leather, dust-stained, steady. Ethan Cole stood between her and Silas, his posture calm but unyielding. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't threaten. He simply looked at Silas and said, "She's coming with me." The room seemed to hold its breath. Silas scoffed, but something in Ethan's stillness made him hesitate. No one had ever said those words for Clara before. Coming with me. Not because she was owned, not because she owed, because she mattered enough to be taken somewhere else. Ethan lifted her carefully, like she was something breakable, and carried her outside. The sunlight was blinding. The town watched from doorways and windows, curiosity buzzing but compassion absent. Clara felt the sway of the horse beneath her as Ethan helped her up behind him, his presence solid and warm at her back. As they rode away, the sounds of the town faded. The whispers, the judgments, the certainty that she would never be more than what they decided she was. Clara rested her forehead against Ethan's coat, unsure whether this was rescue or just another place to fail. But for the first time in a long while, no one was hitting her for being too sick to work. And that alone felt like a miracle she didn't yet trust. The ranch sat quiet beneath a wide, forgiving sky, the kind that made room for things to breathe. Weathered boards caught the last of the afternoon light, and the wind moved gently through the cottonwoods as if it knew how to speak softly here. When Ethan lifted Clara down from the horse, her legs trembled, not from fear this time, but from the unfamiliar sensation of being handled with care. Inside, the house smelled of wood smoke and old soap. Nothing fancy, nothing polished, just clean in the way that meant effort had been given without expectation of praise. Ethan set her on the edge of a narrow bed and placed a cup of water in her hands. He didn't watch her drink. He stepped back, giving space, as though he understood that kindness could be just as overwhelming as cruelty when a person wasn't used to either. Clara slept for hours. Deep, heavy sleep that wrapped around her bones and refused to let go. When she woke, a blanket rested over her shoulders, and the coughing that usually tore at her chest had softened to a distant ache. The pain wasn't gone, but it wasn't shouting anymore. Days passed in quiet rhythms. Ethan never asked what she could do. He asked what she needed. Sometimes that meant rest. Sometimes it meant sitting on the porch, watching dust drift across the yard. Other times, when her strength allowed, Clara folded laundry or swept slowly, stopping whenever her breath grew thin. No punishment followed. No disappointment flickered in Ethan's eyes. That was when something inside her began to shift. One morning, she laughed without meaning to. It startled her so badly, she covered her mouth, eyes wide, as if laughter were something dangerous that needed permission. Ethan looked up from the stove, brow furrowed, then smiled, small and unsure, like he'd forgotten how. He burned the biscuits that day, and they ate them anyway, crumbs scattered across the table, sharing silence that felt warm instead of empty. At night, Clara lay awake listening to the wind and thinking about how strange it was to exist without being afraid of footsteps. She found herself humming softly while folding cloth, melodies she hadn't known she remembered. Each small act felt like a rebellion against the life she'd been told was all she deserved. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in tired gold, Clara finally spoke of her illness. How it had started as a weakness, how the beatings made it worse, how fear had hollowed her from the inside. Her voice shook, but she didn't stop. Ethan listened without interrupting, his hands folded, his gaze steady. When she finished, he told her about his wife. How sickness had taken her slowly. How he'd work himself raw trying to outrun the truth. How he'd failed her not through cruelty, but through silence and helplessness. The words came heavy, like stones lifted one by one from his chest. They sat with their shared grief between them, not fixing it, not smoothing it away, just letting it exist. That night, something unspoken settled into place. Not love declared, Not promises made. Just two broken people recognizing each other's wounds without turning away. The peace didn't last quietly. One morning, dust rose on the horizon, sharp and deliberate. Clara felt it before she saw it. The old tightening in her chest, the instinct to make herself small. Silas Crow rode up with the sheriff beside him, their horses restless, their purpose clear. Town judgment had followed her even here. Silas spoke loudly, confident, claimed ownership, claimed she owed him, claimed sickness didn't excuse obligation. The sheriff stood stiffly, eyes darting, looking for the easiest path through the moment. Ethan didn't step forward. He stepped beside Clara, silence stretched, the kind that presses on the ears. Everyone waited for Clara to disappear, to lower her eyes, to let others speak for her, like they always had. Her hands shook, but she held them together. She thought of cold floors and withheld meals. She thought of clean water and burned biscuits. She drew a breath that hurt and spoke. "I'm not property," she said, voice thin but steady. "And I'm not lazy. I was sick, and I was hurt, and I survived anyway." The words didn't echo. They didn't need to. Something in them landed heavy. A neighbor stepped forward, then another. Murmurs shifted, uncertain now. Stories came out in fragments. Things seen, things ignored too long. The sheriff's shoulders sagged. He cleared his throat and told Silas to leave. Not dramatically, just firmly. Enough. When they were gone, the yard felt impossibly quiet. Clara realized she was standing tall, breath shaking but whole. No one was dragging her anywhere. No one was deciding her worth for her. She turned to Ethan. He didn't ask her to stay. He didn't ask her to go. He waited. "I want to be here," she said. It was the first choice she'd ever spoken aloud. Seasons shifted gently after that. Clara's strength returned in small measures. A longer walk, a fuller breath, a steadier hand. She and Ethan worked side by side, close but never crowded. Some evenings they sat on the porch as the sky darkened, shoulders brushing, sharing stories that didn't always need endings. One sunset, Clara stood alone at the edge of the porch, watching the light slip behind the hills. Her body still bore scars. Her illness hadn't vanished like a miracle, but she was standing, breathing, free. And maybe that's the part worth remembering. Because sometimes healing doesn't arrive with thunder or applause. Sometimes it comes when one person sees another's pain and chooses not to look away. Sometimes dignity returns not through strength, but through being allowed to rest. If you're listening to this and carrying a quiet hurt of your own, remember this: you were never weak for needing time. You were never broken for struggling to stand. Somewhere, maybe not yet, maybe not soon, there's a place where your pain will be met with patience. And that, more than anything, is how lives begin again.